Prior to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Ali Allawi was a professor at Oxford University and a prominent critic of Saddam Hussein's regime. Since the establishment of the interim government in Iraq, Mr. Allawi has held positions as Minister of Defense, Trade and Finance. His latest book about the invasion and its aftermath is The Occupation of Iraq, Winning the War, Losing the Peace. Mr. Allawi discusses his book with Roland Flamini, foreign policy columnist for CQ Weekly. Prior to joining CQ, Mr. Flamini was chief international correspondent at United Press International and a foreign correspondent for Time magazine.
The Iraq invasion, together with its aftermath, is the defining crisis of our time, I think. And of course it's produced already, even though it's still an ongoing problem, a shelf load of books. Yours is different in many ways. One way, of course, is that you're an Iraqi. The second is that you're an insider because of your having been a cabinet minister in not one, but I think two successive governments. And thirdly, because it's a scathing indictment, not just of the Americans and the American performance in trying to reconstruct post-Saddam Iraq, but also of many of your own colleagues and people. Now, I want to read you something from the book that it says that you yourself arrived shortly after the fighting ended, if I have it right. Yeah. And you say that the actual picture was close to a chaotic movie with villains, heroes, and extras wandering on and off the set, and a massive crowd of sullen and disappointed onlookers. Now, the American expectation had been, of course, that there would be joyous scenes of welcome and people throwing flowers, a sort of reenactment of Paris in 1945, whereas this did not happen. Could you perhaps give me some idea of why there was this disparity between American expectations and the Iraqi actuality?
Well, I think the main reason is because very few people were aware of the true conditions inside Iraq. Very few people were aware of the effects of decades of dictatorship and wars and insurrections on the social makeup of the country and the social cohesiveness. And when the Americans came, they were led by this simplistic or naive view that because they were overthrowing a dictatorship, there's going to be massive scenes of rejoicing. They forgot to put the invasion in the context of Iraq's recent history, as well as its legacy of very serious and unresolved issues between its major component groups. That, I think, was the main reason for this dichotomy, as it were, between what people were expecting before the war and what they actually found. And I think that was the beginning of the process where the reality began to spin away from the model that was being portrayed before the war.
But was there a model? Because, I mean, it seems to me that, as you yourself say in the book, I mean, the Americans had been extremely well prepared for the war, which was the actual fighting, and that was extremely fast and successful. But also, they didn't seem to be very prepared for the peace. Now, we know, of course, that there was a sort of blueprint which had been prepared by the State Department, and in fact it said, for example, do not, among its suggestions was, do not disband the police, do not disband the army, you know, watch out because you're going to have to deal with looters. But this was, as far as we can gather, this was sort of discarded by the Defense Department. But it seems to me that although there was a large number of exiles who were active outside the country, there wasn't actually a plan. I mean, nobody came into the country with a program knowing what to do, did they?
No, I don't think so. I mean, even the so-called Future of Iraq project, which was supported by the State Department, right, and in which I participated in a number of the meetings, really did not discuss the details of either post-war planning or administration of the country. It was a set of sometimes academic or theoretical exercises dealing with each particular sector, and a few not poorly conceived, I would say, policy prescriptions that were somehow disconnected from either the reality on the ground or as what they thought was going to be a blueprint for running the government. There was no plan of any consequence. I mean, the Pentagon established an office called the Office for Special Plan, and it was really more concerned about implementing specific radical policy decisions relating, as it were, to the deconstruction of the dictatorial Iraqi state. The State Department countered with this Future of Iraq project, but frankly, if you look at it in terms of its substance, there really wasn't much to it. One or two of the committees did produce quite a lot of paper, but you can't say that this is a detailed map or roadmap for administering the country in a post-war environment. My only explanation for that is that perhaps at the back of mind of the main policy planners in Washington was that this war is going to be such a quick in and out affair that there really was no need for any detailed post-war operational planning, which really sort of dovetails with what I was saying earlier, that there was very little understanding of the makeup of the country and the consequences of upending, as it were, a long-established power structure. The whole thing was handled in a very cavalier way. Even if you are extremely charitable and say that there was a case to be made that it would have been a quick in, quick out type situation, and they would have handed over power to an Iraqi government. Therefore, there really was no need to do any detailed planning, something like what happened in Grenada, for example. The US went in, overthrew the government, went out, and nothing really happened much after that. But in Iraq, it was a very serious misunderstanding of the internal conditions of the country.
But how well were the internal conditions actually known, even by the emigres? I mean, you also in your book make the point that Muqtada al-Sadr sort of popped out of a hat like a rabbit, and nobody seemed to know anything about the whole al-Sadr movement, either its strength or its ability to rally people, as indeed it did this week. So, I mean, is it necessarily just the Americans who were, let's say, poorly informed?
No, I mean, the Iraqi exile community generally may not have been poorly informed. Certainly the Kurds were not poorly informed about what was going on in their neck of the woods. I mean, they knew, obviously, they've been administering Iraqi Kurdistan for nearly over 10 years. So they knew what was going on. But the other opposition groups, each one had their own particular agenda and their own particular perspective. And they were not prepared to really do anything that would threaten their own march to increasing their power. You referred to the Sadrist movement. The Sadrist movement arose as a result of Ayatollah Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, who was in some ways out of the main range of the chief spiritual leaders in Najaf. Right. He emerged as a powerful popular movement and threatened the power base of some of the exiled Islamist parties. So they actually ignored him throughout the 1990s, and in some cases wrote tracts against him and accused him of being a government agent and so on. When he was killed, his movement numbered in the millions. It was the only mass movement in Iraq under difficult and dictatorial conditions. But it posed a threat to the other parties.
And he was killed in...
He was assassinated by regime operatives.
Right.
But his movement, which was a kind of mass spiritual movement, went underground after his death in 1999. And people thought it had basically dispersed. It was brought down by the government. But in reality, it continued to function as a cohesive movement underground. And when the Ba'ath regime was overthrown, it emerged in the light of day as a very powerful mobilizing force for Iraqis, obviously Shia Iraqis, who were living in the country in the 1990s.
A movement led by his son, Muqtada al-Sadr.
Well, not so much by his son, but by as it were, a loose coalition of committees that were coordinated in some kind of
But it's the son who
council.
gets pushed forward as a
Yes.
sort of...
I mean, the son was a figurehead because he was the only surviving. His other two brothers were killed
Now,
together.
is he
with the
still a
Ayatollah.
figurehead, or is he in control of some of it?
Well, the Sadrist
At least some
movement,
of it.
yes. I mean, he is in control, I think, the bulk of it. Maybe up to, you can't really put a specific percentage, but a number of his key lieutenants have formed their own independent fiefdoms, as it were, within the movement. So he may be able to coordinate most of the drive of the Sadrist movement, but not all of it.
The other point that has been made to me by other Iraqis is that what is missing here in the perception of especially Americans is that Muqtada al-Sadr and his movement that there is a sort of class distinction there.
Yes.
Is this true?
Yes, there is definitely a class distinction. A number of very important social developments took place in the 1990s. Because of hyperinflation, emigration, exile, killings, and so on, the middle class really disappeared in Iraq. And as a result, there was this mass of undifferentiated Shia who had just been subjected to a very powerful repression after the failure of the 1991 uprising. And they were looking, I think, for some kind of guidance. And Ayatollah Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr provided that. He provided the guidance, firstly spiritual, and then gradually moved into the political phase. So the Sadrist movement is mainly a movement of the poor underclass, the Shia underclass, especially those who migrated from rural areas into the urban areas, especially in Baghdad. You had something called Thawra City, or Revolution City, which was a large suburb of Baghdad, and drew in these migrants from the south, and it became the stronghold of the Ayatollah Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr. The other Islamist movement, there are two major ones. One is the Dawah Party. Dawah Party is really a movement of intellectuals and people from the middle classes. It drew its support from professionals, it drew its support from senior government bureaucrats, and it had a different kind of flavor to it. The movement associated with the Hakim family, the so-called Supreme Council, was really a movement of the classical senior religious authorities. And it was connected to the sons of the late Grand Ayatollah Muhsin al-Hakim. So each one had, as it were, a different flavor, a different class base, and a different perspective on events. The Sadrist movement is locally grown, owed very little in its formative years to any outside influence, was disconnected from both Iran and from the sort of Islamist intellectuals, and was a movement of the poor and dispossessed. So there is a class division within the Shia Islamist movement, no doubt.
The other thing I wanted to mention about these internal and in Saddam's day clandestine movements is that when the Americans arrived, there was no, it seemed to me that no underground political group emerged to help them take over. You've covered part of this, but I mean, and similarly, there was no underground resistance movement that sort of came out and met the Americans halfway and said, okay, here we are, we'll give you a hand with this. So that although, there was opposition outside of the country and obviously a great resentment inside the country, it didn't somehow gel into a movement. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I mean, the power of the Saddamist authorities inside Iraq was really quite extensive. It was one of the most repressive and complete totalitarian systems, I think, of modern times. It had layers and layers of intelligence services, layers and layers of intelligence operatives, maybe up to 500,000 people were involved in the security services. That's the non-military side. So there wasn't much chance for any organized movement outside of Kurdistan, obviously, to emerge. Saddam really decimated the potential Iraqi opposition in the 1980s and 90s. And when the Americans came, the only force that was there, it was quite a powerful force, were the Sadrists, but they were not prepared to either acknowledge it, not being aware of its true scope beforehand. Neither were the opposition parties who came back into Iraq, especially those that came back from Iran, the Islamist parties, were prepared to give these people any credence. So you had the sort of unusual situation is that as the Americans were moving towards Baghdad, in their wake, the towns and cities of the south felt like kingpins to either the Sadrist movement or to the movement associated with the Supreme Council in Iran, which took over some of the main border towns like Kut and so on.
But Baghdad was not affected by this.
Baghdad was not affected except Sadr city, which accounts for nearly 2.5 million people, and it's probably bigger than Baghdad proper. So Sadr city en masse collapsed in favor of the Sadrist movement. And the scenes of jubilation that were filmed in the early days were really of people in Sadr city, because it was surrounded, abused, and quarantined by the regime, and suffered a great deal actually for its support of Ayatollah Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr. Thousands of people disappeared in the 1990s from Sadr city, and there was very little services, there were very little educational facilities there, and the standard of living of people there was lower, even the abysmally low Iraqi standard of living. So to them it was not so much thanks to the Americans for liberating us, it's just this terrible weight has been lifted off their back. But instead of giving their allegiance to the quote-unquote liberators, they obviously gave their allegiance to those who stood by them for the last decades.
And did this condition their attitude towards the new arrivals?
Yes, I
like
think
yourself,
so. Yes, I mean, there were a number of us who were individual oppositionists. I mean, I was not organized in any political party, so I came back basically on my own steam. But people who had been associated with especially rival Islamist movements were confronted by the rise of the Sadrist movement after the fall of the regime, for example, and sometimes with fatal results, like what happened when the son of the late Grand Ayatollah al-Khou'i, Abdul Majid al-Khou'i, flew back from London via Bahrain to Iraq to stake a claim in the politics of the holy city of Najaf. And as you may know, he was challenged by the Sadrist and lost his life in a street melee. So in other towns and cities there was an uneasy division of power between the Sadrists and those parties that came from abroad. In some cases there was a limited amount of cooperation. In other cases it was a distribution of power.
I see.
In other cases it was one party dominated the local scene. So within a few weeks after the fall of the regime, you had like a patchwork of Islamist parties taking over most of the south as well as Sadr city, while the Americans were sort of ensconced in the Republican palace, not really knowing the extent of the takeover.
We'll get the Americans in a minute, but does this pattern of control still exist, or has it changed over the last 4 years?
The pattern in its broad outline is the same. I mean, the areas that fell under the control of the Islamist parties continue to be under their control. What has changed is the relative power between various groups. Some groups became less important, others became more important. And what has also changed is that the Islamist parties in government have been using their power inside government to marginalize those outside of government, especially the Sadrist movement. So if you look at it in terms of Islamist, non-Islamist, then things probably have not changed. I think the Islamist range is probably extended. But if you look at it, who's on top in what part of the country and what the relative power is, that has changed because other actors have come into it too. So it's become quite a complex network of allegiances in the country.
So, but you make the point, of course, in the book that the Islamist wave that swept over Shia Iraq was a tsunami. And this is the point that you're making now. So is the idea of a secularist Iraq, which after all was it was before, at least on the surface under Saddam, now dead?
I think a secularist Iraq will take a long time to regroup, let's say. It may have a second chance if the Islamists in power botch it up, as it were, and they allow for continuation of relatively free and unfettered elections. You may get a changeover of mood. But as things stand right now, I think the challenge is not how the secular middle class or the liberal middle classes can seek power. It's rather how they can survive. I mean, now it's an issue of survivability, I think, rather than an issue of organizing to achieve power. They were given plenty of opportunity, I might add, after the war. They were given support by the US administration, by the CPA, which constantly pushed the secularist agenda. But their political champions were not able to translate that into street power and into voting power. So
because of numbers?
Numbers, yes. There are just not that many people who follow that line. Mainly because I think of the destruction or the near destruction of the Iraqi middle classes.
And what about the Christian element?
The Christian element is, I mean, it always accounted for maybe 3 to 5% of Iraq's population and was an important element in the development, as it were, of a secular culture amongst the middle classes. But again, you have to see it in historical context. The Christian element began to leave Iraq in the 1980s in large numbers. And before there was migration of Christians for example, towards the West, but mainly as workers in Detroit and the auto factories. But in the 1980s, as the Iran-Iraq war started, it became more noticeable. In the 1990s, with the launching of the so-called faith campaign of Saddam, which increased religiosity in the Iraqi state, and Saddam and the Ba'ath Party pushed for a religious agenda in the 1990s, mainly to counter both the Shia Islamists as well as kind of in recompense for their secular days. Again, more Christians, left the country because they also had the foreign network to allow them to move and get residence and immigrant visas in various Western countries. By the time the regime was overthrown, I think the number of Christians in Iraq probably dwindled to half of its stable level. And then, in the last 3 or 4 years, with the increasing violence and increasing joblessness and the increased racial and religious tensions, that led to even another exodus. So now the Christian element in Iraq is probably not more than 1% of the total population.
We have to take a break now, and we will continue very shortly.
Afterwards, and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with Ali Allawi and Roland Flamini in a moment.
Former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich sat down recently with the Washington Post to discuss the books that influenced him. The following is his suggested reading list. Team of Rivals. Doris Kearns Goodwin details Abraham Lincoln's campaign for the presidency. Globalization, the Rise of China, and the Fall of the Nuclear Family are just some of the topics visited in Revolutionary Wealth by Alvin and Heidi Toffler. In Leadership, Rudy Giuliani remembers the 9/11 attacks and describes his response as New York mayor. Then former New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton writes about his efforts to reduce crime in The Turnaround. Michael Lewis' Moneyball chronicles the Oakland Athletics 2002 season, when low-budget acquisitions based on statistics rather than star power placed them first in their division. Next, Robert Remini's 3-volume set about the 7th president, The Life of Andrew Jackson. In 1976, Jimmy Carter, a lesser-known candidate, beat incumbent Gerald Ford for president. Stanford professor Norman Nye analyzes voting trends from this election and the changing American voter. John Nicolay and John Hay are the editors behind the 10-volume Complete Works of Abraham Lincoln. Harold Holzer looks at one of history's most influential campaign speeches in Lincoln at Cooper Union. And finally, Newt Gingrich recommends his own book, Rediscovering God in America, which chronicles the use of God in political language. To read Al Kamin's article, visit WashingtonPost.com and search Professor Gingrich.
Afterwards with Ali Allawi and Roland Flamini continues.
Let me read you what you said about the attitude of other Arab and Gulf states, and this comes from the Donors Conference. You say that the Arabs were uniformly unsympathetic to Iraq's plight and could barely disguise their hostility to the invasion and their resentment to its consequences. Now, Hussein, on the other hand, was unpopular in the Arab world. So why would they be this hostile?
Well, I think a number of factors behind that, but the most important, I think, relate to the changing of the power structure in Iraq. In spite of Saddam Hussein being a secularist, a radical in his youth, and the fact that Iraq invaded and occupied another Gulf country, an Arab country, didn't change the basic nature of the country. Iraq was still dominated by a minority, albeit in an extreme and maybe unacceptable form. But that power system, where a Sunni Arab minority defined the nature of the Iraqi state as being Arab, as being oriented against Iran, as being something that can be a part, as it were, of the Arab front, especially as it relates to Israel. That kind of mindset continued to prevail and continue to inform the positions of countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So the historic Iraqi state, which was founded on the basis of basically sectarian advantage, pushed Iraq into a camp that was defined by Arabism and also by Sunni Islam. The changing of the nature of the state in two fundamental ways. First of all, it ceased to be a centralized state, which most Arab states are.
It ceased to be a Sunni state.
It ceased to be a Sunni state. So it opened up all kinds of potential problems for these countries. The fact that we're moving towards a kind of confederal arrangement between Kurds and Arabs. The fact that the Shias were disempowered in Iraq were empowered as a result of the overthrow of the regime, creating all kinds of shockwaves amongst Shia Arab minorities in the Gulf countries and in Saudi Arabia. In some cases, they are in fact majorities, like in Bahrain, or pluralities, as they are in Lebanon. So there was a threat that the Arab nation-state system, as it were, was being undermined by changes in Iraq. The other problem, I think, is obviously to do with the unacceptability over the long term of foreign forces coming in to change the nature and structure of states and governments.
In other words, American interference was not welcome in that sense.
Well, it may have been welcome, for example, in the first Gulf War, where it came to overthrow or to change the situation in Kuwait, but an occupation, an invasion occupation, an army coming across 7 seas.
To induce regime change.
Yes, I mean, it opened up another set of issues. I think another problem also was the way in which the Arab governments dealt with the ascendant neoconservatism in the United States in the 2002-2003 period. They were not quite sure how to deal with it, because the signals coming from Washington is that the old ways are over now. We intend to promote democracy, we intend to promote human rights, we intend to promote civic institutions, we're against authoritarian governments. That obviously sent another set of anxiety waves, as it were, in these countries. And all of these crystallized in this new beast that was emerging in Iraq. They didn't know how to handle it. So the best way was to try to quarantine it and stay away from it.
Well, now I would like to ask you about the American involvement. You are robustly critical, I think, of Paul Bremer and of the Coalition Provisional Authority, which was, of course, the first administrative body that was set up to handle, the Iraqi transition. And you say, for example, that when Prime Minister Allawi took over, quote, he inherited a country that had visibly deteriorated under the CPA's stewardship. It was not only the security conditions that were becoming ever more violent. The average lot of the citizenry was pitiful. The shocking mismanagement of the country was plain for all to see, but the true extent of it would appear later as the documentary evidence began to mount. Elsewhere, you speak of the frank amateurism and swaggering arrogance of too many of the CPA's recruits. Incidentally, these were not professional diplomats or professional AID men, but political appointments. Now, so is this then the root of Iraq's subsequent problems, the fact that the CPA laid a poor foundation, or no foundation at all, really, for what was to follow?
Well, it's part of the problem, but it is really to do with the incoherence of US policies in Iraq after the fall of the regime. I mean, the CPA came only after another administrative entity had been established called the Office for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Aid. Nobody really knew what this entity, the CPA, was supposed to do. I mean, it had, according to the UN resolution, a mandate to administer the country. But they themselves were not sure whether this was like an occupying authority the way Germany was occupied, or whether this was going to be something for a very short period of time to be replaced by a yet undefined political process. So there was this huge uncertainty surrounding the actual nature of this entity. The leadership provided, I think, by Paul Bremer may not necessarily have been the best for an entity that was very ambiguous in its terms of reference and its mandate. Within this ambiguity, there was suddenly plonked huge amounts of money as a result of the passing of the supplemental $20 billion reconstruction support that the United States gave Iraq. So it had to establish mechanisms for administering a massive aid program. It has to also establish mechanisms for administering the country and realizing on the many silly promises made to the population of Iraq in terms of services and electricity provision and so on, while at the same time it had quite an undefined mandate and an undefined and indeterminate period of life. So it was a very strange and awkward beast that was not really capable either of administering what it was supposed to have been doing, or holding the fort at a minimum, or being the party in charge of a major reconstruction effort, or being the party in charge of restructuring Iraqi society and politics and putting it on a new track. Within a few months of the CPA's life, it became clear that its life was limited, but it still had these other functions that it was supposed to do. This incoherence, I think, is what really sank the entire organization. And I don't think any leadership could have saved this wreckage from the incoherent policies that were imposed on it or that it itself proposed. And just an example, I mean, the Iraqi government that I was a member of, the first one, we were supposed to be responsible to the governing council, an Iraqi appointed body, a CPA appointed body. We were not sure who held the ultimate authority. It turned out that the CPA held the purse strings and in the process could veto any power. Also, Bremer had the power to authorize all laws. So you had decrees and regulations passed by the governing council, ignored by Bremer. You had decisions and policies and programs promoted by government departments and ministries only to see that there's no funding for them. So the whole thing basically spun out of control.
But is it that they didn't have a mandate, or was it that the mandate which they had was that they had a succession of mandates which kept changing as the policy changed in Washington?
Yes, I mean, this is partly the principal mandate that the CPA had was the one that authorized it under the UN resolution.
Right.
But the timeline associated with its mandate, the depth to which it was supposed to engineer a new Iraqi state and society, the funds that were thrown at it in order to achieve short-term political gains. This was a jumble, really, of incoherent, often contradictory policies and programs. And as a result, the entity just buckled under. It was jerry-built, and it was unable to cope, I think, with its inherent contradictions and the inherent incoherence of American policy.
But you do say in the book that once the CPA began to hand over responsibilities to AID and to State Department officials who were professionals, things began to improve.
Yes, that is true. I mean, after the professionals, as it were, came in with the handover of sovereignty to an interim Iraqi government, then the administration of these programs moved to more professional hands. But a lot of the damage had already been done by the incoherent, by the off-handed policies of the CPA. So there was a number of projects and programs that were inherited by these main aid granting agencies and the professional US and other government departments that were involved in Iraq. But this came only, I think, towards the end of the CPA's life, around April, May of 2004, when this handover began to take place. But I think a great deal of the damage had already happened.
You are quite, I mean, one of the positive notes in your book is the election, which you say, was successful in its way, and seemed to hold a lot of promise, which eventually wasn't quite fulfilled. As the confidence, if you like, of Iraqi politicians in power increased, you get the impression that they sort of ran increasingly into conflict with what the Americans wanted to do. How deep and how damaging was this conflict?
I think it was quite serious, because if there was an American project, I mean, obviously the American and the West generally wanted to see the success of a large, moderate, liberal center, in spite of the incoherence and in spite of the contradictory policies that they followed. The first test of that were the elections. But the elections really did not respond, the populace did not respond to the fact that it was just being liberated, and therefore would give its allegiance to those groups and parties who hung their hat, as it were, on the ideal of liberation. What was happening in the elections, especially in the first set of elections in January 2005, was that Iraqis were voting basically their identity, prompted to some extent by the desire of their main religious authorities, especially amongst the Shia, that they should organize themselves collectively as a consciously Shia group. So the liberals and the moderates were left out of this equation, except as minor parties who sort of strung along. The elections of January 2005, which was supposed to lead to some kind of representative middle-class secular party emerging in the form of Ayad Allawi's group, found in fact that the elections of 2005 were a straightforward contest for sectarian and ethnic identity. Kurds voted for Kurdish parties, Shias voted for Shia parties, Sunnis did not really participate in those elections. So the outcome of these elections in fact reinforced the sectarian basis of politics to the disadvantage of the sort of liberal middle ground. who were then subsequently reduced even further in the end-of-year elections of December 2005. So, and I think this is also a misreading on the part of the United States early on. Of course, by the time the elections loomed as an inevitable issue, it became clear that the Islamist parties were going to sweep the field.
Even though Bremer said this would never be an Islamic country, did he not? An Islamist, this would never have an Islamist government,
yes.
if I remember rightly.
And ever since then, there has been sort of a backdoor attempt to try to dilute the Islamist content of the electoral victories, or the consequences of an Islamist electoral victory. So there has always been an attempt to basically deny the fact that the majority of Iraqis voted for ethnic and sectarian parties. And as a result, I think you have this constant tension between the electoral results and the desire of the Western embassies to push for a non-Islamist, non-sectarian line.
Which people like yourself knew wasn't going to happen.
Yes, I mean, it was quite clear that in the first set of elections, there was no Shia in his right mind would have gone against the wave that was emanating.
Right. But given your choice, would you, in fact, have favored the kind of Western type democracy with free elections that the Bush administration envisioned for Iraq? More or less, I think, flushed, if you like, with the success of what had happened shortly before that in Afghanistan. Or is there some other form of democratic system that you think would have been more acceptable and easier to introduce and to establish?
I think the whole political process which ended up in the setting up, as it were, of the political/institutional architecture of Iraq was condensed in such a short period of time that it would have been impossible to really come up with different outcomes, different results. There was just not enough time to allow for these issues to be debated and to see whether, for example, the Constitution. The Constitution, in effect, was written in a few weeks. Now, it was not supposed to be that, in that way. In my mind, it should have been really an attempt to redefine the nature of Iraq and to redefine the relationship between the communities in order to create a common sense, a common notion of Iraqiness, citizenship, and so on. Instead, it became a document that basically divided power between various ethnic and sectarian groups. Whether Iraq can maintain a democracy in the Western sense of the word, I find it very difficult to see how this can happen without really a large and functioning middle class. What we need to have is to have a system that ensures there is no abuse of power and there is no new tyrannies being established or new authoritarian systems being established. I would settle for that at this stage. I would settle for a set of checks and balances that stops the parties dominating the state through electoral means from expanding and
But who would oversee the checks and balances?
Well, it should have been through a constitutional mechanism that establishes commissions, which are in many ways above the control of the political parties, that are above the idea of power sharing. Nearly all these commissions now exist in one form or another, but they are part of power sharing formulae. So they will fall under the sway of whoever is the majority party. Some kind of oversight body that really stops the state from turning into the plaything of political parties and stops ministries and government departments being turned into really just gigantic sinkholes. This, unfortunately, the state is moving in that direction as the parties that have won electoral majorities consolidate their power over the state. So it was a very mechanistic process that defined the Iraqi political process after the handover of sovereignty. There were certain milestones. There were to be elections for a constitutional assembly by this date. Then there was supposed to be a constitution drafted by the following date. Then that constitution had to be ratified by that date. And then there were elections.
Local elections too.
All of these things were done in a very, very rigid way. Sometimes, I might add, supported by the majority parties in Iraq, because they wanted to squeeze the political process so that the results work to their advantage. What we have now is a framework of a democracy without really, basically democracy without democrats.
All right, well, as we're approaching the end, I did want to ask you, I did want to get fairly quick answers to a couple of questions. One is, you say at the end that time is running out in Iraq and that the Iraqis are, quote, very near a terminal breaking point. Well, what is your solution? I know you talk about confederal formula. What does that mean?
Well, my solution really is not so much to establish the power of a central state over everybody else, which is what seems to be happening now. It's more to do with creating stable arrangements inside the country that would reduce the level of violence, that would reduce the level of political bickering and tensions and confrontations. Basically recognizing that there are parts of the country that are to some extent secure because, frankly, they're homogeneous in terms of their and building
the Kurdish area being
Kurdish area is one of them. I think most of the Shia South is like that too. And basically creating political structures for these units that would allow them to, at least the populations of to have some kind of stability, and allow them also responsibility for their own security. That leaves the so-called, hot areas or the violent areas. These will also be given enough leeway to manage their own affairs, while the political parties and groups try to fashion, as it were, a new compact based on perhaps a kind of redefinition of the constitution. Without that, I think we'll end up with perhaps with a strengthened central state, but not strengthened enough to control the entire government.
So perhaps it's not exactly square one, but it's square three, maybe, on the way over. And finally, if the U.S. does withdraw within, say, the next 6 months, by the end of the year, let us say, what do you think will happen in Iraq?
I think the central state will not collapse, as many people would think. Probably the contrary would happen, is that the state will be strengthened and the control of the majority parties over it will be strengthened. But the instability and resistance to that will stay the same in the Sunni Arab areas. So it will be, rather than being a kind of peaceful balance, there will be something like 70% of the country in a state of relative stability, dominated by the Kurdistan regional government and a perverted central state, and 20 to 30% of the country in a state of turmoil. This may be an adequate end state.
But 20% of the country, would that include Baghdad?
It may include parts of western Baghdad, because Baghdad in the last year has changed its ethnic and sectarian identity. It's now overwhelmingly a Shia city, and unlikely to change, I'm afraid.
Has the vehemence, has the strength of and the extreme violence of the Sunnis surprised you?
Yes, very much so. I thought that it would be a matter of months, and they would then accept the changed power structure and try to accommodate within it and hope to create a new common sense of Iraqiness and citizenship. But their resistance has been really profoundly destabilizing, I would say, for me. And I did not expect this kind of very violent and in some cases vicious response. Obviously not the Sunni Arab community as a whole cannot be accused of that, but those groups that are fighting in its name, the insurgents as well as the terrorists, their methods and tactics are really terribly violent.
and you see no end to it.
No, because I think they seem to think they're on some kind of winning ticket that violence pays. To some extent, it seems to have paid in Iraq.
Again, very briefly, of course, one of the miscalculations, it seems to me, of the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq war had been that fidelity to Shiism would actually undermine the strength of the Iraqi army, which was presumably in the rank and file Shia. But that never happened. In other words, the Shias were more nationalist than they were Shias. Would you agree with that?
I think this is I'm sorry to say, a kind of deconstruction of the facts. The Shias fought Iran because, to some extent, some were coerced into it. But the war was never popular amongst the Shia rank and file. But in the end, they defended their territory. They were not very good on the attack. They were not very happy when they were in an attacking phase, but they defended their territory, which is, in my mind, an underestimate of Iraqi consciousness on the part of the Shia by the Iranians and by those who banked on a kind of Shia resistance. The fact of the matter is that the Shia are loyal to the country, but not to the state, and became increasingly alienated from the state in the 1990s. One should not make the opposite case now, that because the Islamist parties are
That's what I was
in power.
suggesting.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.